Good, how are you?
Good. Welcome. Are you excited to talk about streamer fishing?
Yes, always.
Is
It's
it
like
your
a way of
favorite?
life for me.
If you had an option, dries, streamers, or uh, nymphing, of course.
Yeah. Olive streamers.
Yeah, yeah. That's where we're on this talk, right?
Yeah.
Um, so thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about streamers today. Shawn, he got a new boat, had to escape. So we've got Courtney. She's from Trouts in Denver, and she knows everything you need to know about fishing streamers up that way. This will be a fun talk, I think, and we'll be able to learn some new stuff from each other and help the people viewing this really get back into it. Um,
Yeah.
so just kind of get started. We're pretty much just going to explore everything streamer fishing, how it's evolving, and how exciting and visual it can really be. So, Courtney, why do you like streamer fishing?
I really got into it. I actually got into it several years into kind of my fly fishing journey. But I always tell people when I do presentations, I get asked this question, like I have ADHD pretty badly. And streamer fishing stuck with me because it's so active and engaging constantly. You're having to be there with the fly, with your strip, with your presentation. It's a quick moving, constant moving approach. And so it just keeps me actively engaged in the moment. And I kind of got addicted to it, I think, honestly, because of that.
Yeah, for
How
sure.
about
It's
you?
super active. Yeah, same thing. I mean, I grew up, down here in Texas. That's what we fish. So it's carried over into other species as well. It's just super visual and an active thing, like you said.
Mhm.
It's hard to beat that, especially when you get a fish aggressively trying to eat that fly and then feeling that tug on a tight line. So
Mhm.
a very exciting way to fish it, and it can really represent all the stuff that we want to mimic, in the water
Mhm.
that is actually being retrieved. So for you up there, like what are the food sources that you typically are you're like targeting or using flies to mimic, I should say.
Imitating, yeah.
Yeah.
It is mainly bait fish. There's like crayfish and stuff like that. For the most part, it's bait fish or just a lot of um, attractor style streamers, right?
Right.
They're not really necessarily imitating anything specific. It's more just drawing out that reactive nature, that protective nature of the fish for the strike. But a lot of it is woolly boogers, slump busters, things for small leeches and or bait
Hmm.
fish or crayfish when we're talking about really specific things that we're typically representing sculpin, things like that. How about
Yeah.
you guys?
Yeah. I mean, we're doing everything from bait fish to crayfish, even sculpins. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of the same stuff,
Same
even
stuff.
for different species. Depending
Yeah.
on what river system you're fishing. In Arkansas, we can mimic all kinds of chubs and different things like that. Then down here, we get a lot of shad and crayfish and different types of bluegill that those fish are really keen in on. And that's the cool thing. It really represents all that large food that
Mm-hmm.
trout, bass, and many other species eat.
High
Um,
protein stuff, the good diet
right.
stuff, right? And I think it's good because it's stuff that's there year round. So I think once I kind of got into streamer fishing, even though I did it with trout, I really got into it for the fact that all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I can streamer fish literally for any fish in any water
Hmm.
condition, be it open ocean, salt, fresh, brackish, it didn't matter. I could take that technique everywhere. And even though some people will be like, one trick pony streamer fishing, I'm like, but yeah, I can literally fish anywhere in the world with, a matter of a certain selection of flies over this style and present to all these different size and types of fish and still have success. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. And it's definitely, I think, one of the easiest methods to get into starting out fly fishing because it's one fly, and you can make this more complicated, but one
Mm-hmm.
fly casting out there and retrieving that fly back with a tight line, so you're going to feel that fish eat the fly,
Mm-hmm.
which is cool. And um, getting started, it can be anything from tying a streamer on like a woolly bugger and just
Mm-hmm.
swinging that fly uh, at a 45-degree angle, casting across current, and just letting that fly swing, to really getting in depth, what we'll talk about later, with different lines and larger flies and different actions of flies and colors and stuff like that.
I mean, you can even get, as simple as, especially here in some of our tailwaters, because we have a lot of tailwater fishing here, or even in stillwater, dropping a little woolly booger or squirrel leech or a mini leech under a bobber, right? You're not even necessarily stripping it, but it is a streamer technically, and you're dead drifting it or just letting it sit under a bobber in different scenarios. So that you can get really simple with streamers and not even be into stripping yet, and you can still be using them as an active pattern on even a nymph rig. So
sure. And that's a good way to learn mending and stuff like that for people that are just getting into it. You're still fishing streamer, but you don't have the complicated nymph rig with multiple flies, just one streamer.
So Keegan already said in here, is a popper a streamer or a dry fly? What do you think?
Yeah. Old buddy Keegan. It's both. That's why we like poppers so much. It's the active retrieve with the aggressive blow up on the fly, right? Can't
the retrieve on topwater, the topwater retrieve.
Yeah. Pop and pause. You fish with redfish and stuff. If you can get a redfish on a topwater fly, it's awesome. It doesn't work all the time though, unfortunately.
No, not all the time, but you definitely can. I have had success on it. And if not, just use a regular streamer.
So I guess, we'll start off talking about how to get started. And some of the simplest ways, I think, and we'll talk about this, is just a woolly bugger, a 9-foot leader. And with your 5-weight, you go out there and you start fishing it, swinging it, or directly casting across current and stripping it back, or dead drifting underneath the indicator. But, outside of that, the next level, I guess you could say, and something that I personally like to always carry if I'm fishing a 5-weight, because it's just so versatile, I'll carry the poly leaders around with me, and I'll have possibly different densities of those, intermediate, heavy sink, the different ones that we would typically carry here at the store, like these. Everything's backwards.
So I think for like anyone who's listening that hears poly leader, so poly leader is just essentially a different version of your standard leader that you put on the end of your line, except it's coated typically in a PVC type coating, so it creates a sink for it. So we call them poly leaders, and it's essentially it's a sinking leader, in other words. And so, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, you can get into different levels and weights and sizes of lines. But kind of to Steven's point, the biggest thing that's really easy and simple to start with is just doing the leader and doing the sinking leader and putting that on the end of your standard floating line that you probably already have on your 5-weight, so that you can just start with some easy presentation and sink with some smaller streamers.
For sure. It's super simple. It's just like attaching a standard leader on, a loop-to-loop connection. There are some things that I think you and me both like when fishing those poly leaders, is adding a micro swivel or a tippet ring even in between, the poly leader and your tippet. That way you're not cutting back in the poly leader, and they'll last forever. Maybe not forever, but for a good amount of time. And I like micro swivels. Oh my gosh. Because because they keep those even small streamers from spinning your leader up and causing problems while you're casting.
Yeah, and I think those poly leaders, they are a little more expensive. You get one typically in a pack, but because of the type of material that's on them, they don't break down easily unless you really damage them. So investing in the swivels to put on the little end. So at the end of your poly leader, there'll be a little bit of an exposed regular leader material that's not coated. And so you can put that swivel right there on that, just with a clinch knot, basically like you would to your fly. And then you can clinch other leader off the other end. And I often get asked with these, well, if you do leader off the other end, how much do you do? And I always tell them, enough so that I can have some good movement in that streamer. Because remember, when we're streamer fishing, we are the presentation of the streamer. So how we choose to strip and how we choose to move it is what puts the action into it and makes it look the most natural. So you want enough to allow not natural movement, but you don't want to get so far from the poly leader, just like a weight and nymphing, that your streamer's starting to float up again. Because the whole point of using that poly leader is you want to get it down, right? It's helping with some of that sink. So enough to create action, but not so much that you're losing the intention of the sinking leader.
Right. And depending on the fly you use, if it's a jig head fly or a standard fly, you'll get different actions with those. And so adding more tippet for that might help. And I think something important to pick or point out is poly leaders are really excel in, typical trout streams where you don't have a whole lot of depth. You might be fishing a riffle, swinging a fly, but you're in that kind of 3 foot to 4 foot depth, and you're able to get that fly down. Once you get over that and you need to break the surface quick, that's when you start to transition into different stuff. But it's super simple to throw on and just go fish, And so with a 5-weight, it's super easy. Just carry your dry fly setup, change it out to a streamer setup, and go. Is there anything else you go ahead?
No, I was just going to say, actually, Paul just put a good question in the chat, which I think is kind of a natural progression with exactly what we're talking about. Was favorite knot for tying your streamer. I know for me, it's a non-slip mono. So I like having that loop. When you're first learning, though, if you don't know that knot, you can absolutely start with your standard clench knot. Just know that I have a PowerPoint streamer talk that I do a lot, like fly fishing shows and other areas. And I have a video in there that I pulled literally off Google, and it's a streamer with a clench knot on it, and then a streamer with a non-slip loop knot. And they're in some of the action motion tanks side by side. And it's crazy the visual difference by going to that loop knot from going to the clench. Just giving that little bit more availability for the fly to actually move. It's such a good visual to like compare and really see that slight change in knot, although you can totally use a clench knot, can seriously change the entire presentation of your fly. It's pretty crazy.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's good to touch on if you're using those micro swivels or a tippet ring, we typically just use clench knots to attach that tippet to poly leader. But there's all different knots out there, and there's not a set rule. But yeah, a loop knot is not only going to give a little bit more action, but it's also a stronger knot than a clench knot. So if you get a big fish on that tight line, what we're all hoping for, it's not going to slip or break, hopefully. So, how would you rig your streamer setup if you were going out today and go fish?
So my standard setup is a 9-foot 7-weight. I have an Orvis Helios 3D. It's pretty much my go-to rod, 9-foot 7-weight. I do have a sink tip line. Unless I'm in stillwater where I'm really trying to get off a ledge, I'm pretty much religious on a sink tip, typically intermediate sink right around there. And then I typically, as far as leader goes, I'm in the like 2 to 3x realm, just depending on the river I'm fishing here, what size fish I'm expecting, also some of the clarity of the water, because we have some really clear rivers here that are just off snow melt and stuff. So I'm in that 2x to 3x range, and anywhere like 4 to 7 feet in length. And then I do that non-slip mono loop knot on my streamer. I tend to be religious about fishing double articulated. That's my go-to. So I'm sure we'll talk about kind of the double streamer setup. I don't fish that as much preferentially, but I typically do fish a double articulated. What about you?
Yeah, around here, I'm usually a 7-weight. That's my go-to rod for Texas and majority of what I do, and it's a 7D Helios. I really like intermediate and then heavy sink lines, and I kind of go between the two depending on the fly choice and also water depth or structure. Typically intermediate line does well for me. And we'll get into, and I saw someone had a question about poly leader versus sink tip lines. We definitely, if we're just streamer fishing, we all are going to like a designated line for that option because it does cast better. It presents the fly better, and it does give you more options for depth control. The longer that sink tip is, the more depth you can get out of your line. So like our standard bank shot sink tip is what I would use most of the time. That's a really heavy line. It makes it really easy to get a fly out there quick without very much false casting. But then, if I'm going somewhere and I'm fishing a lake, I might go into the depth charge line where it's got this 30-foot sink tip to the intermediate to get it down to those depths where I need to be. Even on the white here, we'll fish those 30-foot sink tips because we have space. We're on boats fishing them. And it just helps break that surface and get that fly in the zone where those fish are. And this is something for you and me. We probably, when you're presenting a streamer, I personally smack that thing down as hard as I can. It's the alert to get those big fish kind of looking up and looking up at the streamer.
Yeah. I also think a lot of times for you guys, I'm sure in Texas, we have a lot of really small streams in Colorado. And so where you guys are fishing, probably not always, but there's situations where you're probably really wanting to get longer cast out, right? So having those 30-foot tip or sinking lines also help to load that rod and get those cast out there with the streamer on the end, I think is also beneficial. Whereas for me, a sink tip, a lot of times I'm just roll casting. So I don't need this like huge 30-foot type thing of my 90-foot line. I just need that sink tip to be directly outside of my tip and in my tip so I can load a quick short cast just to the bank from the boat or something. And I think that even can play into it too, right? How far you have to cast can also help with those when you're trying to get that distance, get that load and shoot that line.
Yeah, and the nice thing with those bank shot lines is that they have a really heavy short head, so you can do a lot of roll cast techniques or two-handed techniques with that line in tight quarters. So it makes it a lot simpler when you're fishing tight waters with streamers and stuff like that. And just so y'all know, he's adding these links to the comments here for these products, so you can go onto the website and check them all out. We'll go through quite a bit of this stuff, but you'll see those pop up there. Let's see if there's any other questions here.
There's actually several. I just saw there's my.
Yeah, there's can you stream your fish on the lake from the shore? If so, do I need to cast and give the fly a moment to sink? Depends on where those fish are. A lot of times I have found in lakes for trout specifically, they are circling around the edges looking for food, but they could be out deeper. Whereas here, if we're fishing for striper, they could be up shallow in the top column, or you might have to sink it down 40 feet. So a lot of things boil down to observation and going out there and kind of watching instead of just casting and seeing what's going on. I like to have both options. So I always typically carry a floating, intermediate, and a heavy sink if I'm in a scenario that I'm not comfortable or don't know what's going on. Yeah. Then I have my options covered. How about you?
So we have a lot of still water because we have a lot of reservoirs in Colorado. So it's super common here. Most of them have trout is kind of the standard fish in them. We also will fish them for pike. And then we have several reservoirs that have now been stocked with wiper. Which one of my favorite fish to fish for all day long. Not quite striper. I haven't striper fished yet. It is like very high on my next few trips. Hopefully it'll happen. But, and to your point for our reservoirs, because a lot of them are man-made dugout, right? They have a very consistent drop. So when we're fishing, our fish are usually cruising the banks right inside that drop. And so if I'm standing on the shore, be it on the shore, on a ladder, on a raised area, I'm really just trying to cast out past that drop because that's, again, typically, historically, consistently where the fish cruise, and I am letting it sink. And depending, again, on how far out that is whether I'm using like a full sink line or just the sinking tip line. So much like you, in those situations, it's not uncommon for me to have two rods, one rigged with each, depending on which part of the reservoir I'm fishing and how far out and all that stuff. But then, I will give, typically, because of the way our trout like to be presented to, I will give a good 3, 5, 7 second sink and then start stripping.
It's I mean, we've waited 2-3 minutes sometimes waiting for those lines to sink.
Yeah.
You know, most of these lines are going to have a certain sink rate per second. So you'll find intermediates 1 to 2 inches per second, type 3s in that 3 to 4 inches per second, type 6, 7s in that 6 to 7 inch per second. So that's kind of a good reference. And then you just multiply that to however long you need to wait for that fly to get down there.
Yeah. And it'll
So-
tell you on the box, guys. So when you're going into the store, besides just like an Orvis rep or retailer or sales individual can definitely help you. But right on the front of the box, it'll actually say the range and IPS, and that stands for inches per second when you see the IPS. And so that'll tell you what the different sink rates are for the different lines. So a lot of times net lines will have very similar names. But if you look at the box, you'll notice that the sink rate is different. It'll say intermediate or intermediate plus or intermediate, you know, whatever. But sometimes an intermediate here is not equivalent to an intermediate here. Different brands will oftentimes range their intermediates differently. So if you look at that sink rate, that's a lot of times what I pay attention to. Is this a full sink or is it a sinking tip? And then what's my sink rate?
Yeah, and if you stop by any of the shops, especially the Orvis retail or the dealers like Trout's in Denver, we're more than welcome to help you get the right sink rate and the right line for your setup. So I mean, we set up people everywhere from everything from trout to golden dorado to anything in between. So we're more than welcome to help you.
And I think when you start to get into those bigger fish, those more specialty fish, it gets really important to have somebody who knows what they're doing to help you set up, because you really want to make sure that you have the balanced line, because that stuff really starts to come in play with presentation, casting, and success with the fish. Whereas a lot of times on a nymph rig, you know, as long as you have a 5-weight floating line on a 5-weight rod, you're pretty good. But when you start getting into these bigger, heavier, more aggressive fish, making sure everything's balanced, it's the correct weight, everything becomes much more important in these scenarios.
For sure. Yeah, and there's lines when you start getting up to the heavier grain weights for heavier rods, you know, king salmon, golden dorado, mahi, any of that stuff. This one's a really cool one, the custom tip. Oh my gosh. And the cool thing with this one is you can cut it to length, and it's got a chart inside that tells you this is where to start, and you can cut it off in inch increments to dial it into your rod specifically. And then you attach a tip and you're good to go. So there's a lot of different lines out there to help with this. Something I think that's super crucial too is when you're setting up your leader, and we talked about this a little bit, but for these different lines, depending on how closely you want your fly to follow the line versus not, I can really make a fly do what I want it to do if I bring it closer to the fly line. The fish are focused on that bigger fly and that option, so they're not as focused on that fly line being in their face. And I'll sometimes get down to a 3-foot leader, and that could be, you know, 1.5 foot of 40-pound to 1.5 foot of 20-pound, and that'd be my simple leader I tie up. And that's kind of some stuff I carry around with me. Fluorocarbon, typically more abrasion resistant, a little bit better for that style of fishing. And then if I'm fishing a deer hair head fly like the sluggo, this is a good one that we usually fish down for browns on the white. It's got that deer hair head, so it does have some buoyancy, and you can work structure really well. So I can have my line sink down below that log while my fly is diving over the side, and I can work it that way with the lines. And then I might use more of like a 6 to 8 foot leader on that one, setting it up a little bit different so I can get that buoyant side of it.
There's a couple of questions in here about Michigan. People keep asking. I'm going to be honest, I don't know. I am not a pro in Michigan, so I don't have answers to your questions. I'm sorry.
So give the stores in Michigan a call. Yes. Grand Rapids store. There's a few other ones, Chicago, and they can tell you everything you need for those rivers up there. So, you know, good call out. And those guys, Nick and those guys up there, more than happy to help you. And there's a lot of dealers up that way. There's a lot of water in Michigan.
A lot of water. Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin. It's very Minnesota. It can be very overlooked in the fly fishing world, I feel like. I mean, for me, I mainly use fluorocarbon. Would you ever choose mono for streamer stuff? I honestly just use mono.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter.
Those kids.
Yeah.
I think there's benefits to fluoro. I think I go through a lot of tippet during guide season. Fluoro's more expensive.
Yeah. For sure.
So I do. I just typically stick to mono. There's a lot, obviously, a different abrasion resistance and different things like that with fluoro. Nothing wrong with either. That just happens to be what I go with. And I don't have a lot of scientific reason around. I just happen to have a lot more of it usually.
Yeah. I mean, you hear it's got more density and
Yeah.
it's clearer in the water, and which if you're fishing the Bahamas, you need some of that, definitely more visible. But a lot of times when we're streamer fishing, we're not worried about the leader as much. I will say it's more abrasion resistant. So if you're worried about structure cutting your line or the fish wrapping you up and stuff that can cut your line, abrasion resistant wise, fluorocarbon's gonna be better. If you're dealing with stuff that's not as sharp and abrasive, then it's not as big of a deal.
Yeah.
And then, the other thing with those swivels and tippet rings, specifically if I'm fishing a streamer line, like the bank shot or these custom sinks, I'm going to use a swivel, and I can break down my short leader from 40 to 20 without worrying about the knot, because now I'm not worried about the two sizes being as close together. You will get a little bit of different. If you drop it from 20 to 12 pound, you're going to get some hinging and some weird casting there. But if you keep it somewhat consistent, it's going to be good.
I think too, the other thing is, besides the abrasion resistance, I typically am fishing such thick tippet, 2X, 3X, 1X, that at that point, like you said, we're really going after that fish's territorial and like natural reaction, right, to things. So they're not typically looking at the tippet. We aren't going after fish that are leader and tippet shy. And when you get into those 2X, 1X, I don't know that there's that big of a difference besides I really understand the abrasion resistance besides that, between the mono and the fluoro. It's thick and it's heavy.
Yeah. I mean, I've used everything from 30 pound straight to, minimum. I usually don't go below 12 pound of some sort. 0X is around, with ours anyways, it's 15 pound. 1X is 12 pound. I will say diameter sometimes matters with how the fly turns over. So it's always good to have something rigid enough that's going to turn that fly over, and so you don't get hinging and weird things, pileups where your streamer doesn't go where you want it to go.
The heavier lines, it just kind of all balances out a little better.
Right. Yep. I mean, we'll still get folks in that are looking for like 3X for their certain streamer, and so bump that up. You're not worried about those fish seeing it as much.
Yeah. Or if you're fishing, you may even be into bite wire too. So.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of stuff out, like SA makes some tieable bite wire, among other companies, that you just tie to your fluorocarbon or mono section, as long as it's somewhat equal in diameter, and you've got 12 plus inches of bite for pike or any toothy fish. If you're out East Coast fishing for striper, you'll be protected against bluefish. Down here, we don't have too much gar. We can use fluoro, and it's still pretty good, unless they're big. But so how would you rig your flies to your setup, the way you like to do it? You already talked about the non-slip mono loop, but would you fish two streamers?
It's not to say that I haven't, because I have. It's just not usually my go-to. That being said, I always tell people, because again, this is another really common question. I always tell people, some of the people who taught me to streamer fish are diehards on two streamers. And they have so much success on them. It's just not something that I personally have ever gotten super comfortable with or have a ton of confidence in. And I personally feel like there's so much about fly fishing related to confidence. And if you don't have confidence in something, but you're, more experienced and comfortable, like I just don't have as much success because I'm not as confident in it. The thing I always do tell people is, please don't double rig. Don't have 4 hooks on. Let's be smart on what streamers we're double rigging, and then making sure we have enough distance between them. because you want that trailer streamer to look natural in its movement, right? Because it has a lot of stuff ahead of it moving before it gets moved behind. And B, to be smart about it, because you don't want the fish to get wrapped, right? So making sure you have enough distance that you're not going to be stripping and nailing the fish along the side with both streamers, making sure there's enough distance for good motion and for safety for the fish if you're going to fish them.
Yeah, you definitely want that distance so you don't foul hook the fish. If you start catching them by the butt, you definitely have a problem.
Yeah.
They fight great, but yeah, it's not the same.
Exactly.
Let's see. Do you still like fishing the classic patterns? Yep, definitely. I fish it all. I like the daces and bucktail squirrels and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I have definitely fished the classic patterns, and then I fish, just today's patterns, however you want to call them. I fish it all. I think at the end of the day, it just depends on what water you're in, what sits in that water, and the biggest thing is what presentation and movement are you putting in that streamer.
Right. And some of these questions I see here, we're going to answer here pretty quickly. So I'm going to skip some, but we're going to get back to this, and you're going to understand a little bit more of that. So for you, how would you choose your flies for that setup? Like, is there anything that you like to? Is there anything like you start off with and then you rotate through, or is there like?
Are you talking like colors or?
Just, yeah, weight, density, colors, action, any of that stuff.
So I mean, my go-to setup's kind of what I explained. Like I have the sink tip. And then I'm usually anywhere from 0 to 3x, depending on the water. Because again, we do have some smaller streams here, so I'm not going to put 0x in a little brookie stream, high mountain, right?
Sure.
So 0 to 3x, I am typically a little bit shorter in my length, so that like 4 to 7 feet, I'll definitely go down to like 3 feet, but that 4 to 5 is probably my most common. My personal go-to streamer that if you've ever seen anything of mine online, whether it's a post or the guys making fun of me at the shop or some of my talks, is an olive streamer. It's a rusty trombone. It's a double articulated fly. That is 100% my go-to. You could just literally for Christmas send me a huge streamer box of just rusty trombones and I'd be fine for the rest of my life. Behind that, I have another streamer called the Goldie, which is basically the white version of the rusty trombone. And those are like my go-to streamers. So I always tell people my personal preference is I'll go olive is my confidence fly. It is my absolute go-to, double articulated. If olive's not working for me, I'll go to white and then I go black last. So I'm very against the grain, which seems to be a theme in my life in general. But most people love black and that's the standard and that's the classic and that's what they go to. But I start olive, go white and in black if I'm changing. And then I think relative to that, when I'm actually fishing, I always liken the changes to, your nymph rig. For me, if I'm nymphing, the first thing I'll change typically is my depth with my indicator because it's the easiest change on my rig. And then I may add more weight. And then the last thing I'm going to do is change my flies. So in streamer fishing, I typically change my presentation through stripping. So maybe I put a pause, maybe I increase my speed, maybe I go from like a straight strip to a swing, right? And then I'll change my presentation, I'll change my depth, then I'll change my streamer before I change color. So what about you?
I do play to the conditions a little bit. I will, say it's a bright sunny day. I'll start with something more flashy and more bright. And then if it's more gloomy, overcast, I'll go to something more natural. But, not a set rule. I've definitely fished Crelexes in the middle of storms, so I do like to switch it up if I'm not getting something or having anything happen or seeing any fish really even try to swipe at a fly. I'm going to change color. And then I might change really outside of that is just how the fly swims. So, you get some flies that are more jerk style and they kick side to side more, and you get some more that jig. And those are the things I'll change. So like a jig head fly with some weight, you get more of that jig. Something that has that pushing head like that is going to push water, and it's going to have more of that keeling side to side action. and then changing the weight so you get that density that you can work structure better with. So,
Do you,
size
when
of
you
fly,
say changing the weight, I feel like this is always a big question in streamer fishing. Do
yeah,
you use weight with your streamers?
definitely. But I like to change it up quite a bit. So one of my go-to flies is the, Circus Peanut or the Peanut Envy,
Yeah.
right? It's just a all around good fly. And that fly doesn't have a whole lot of material and it's got a cone head on it. And the action of it, I think it just keys those fish in. But if I'm really working structure, like say a bunch of logs that are down, and I want to put this fly over the logs and not sink instantly and get hung up in there, I'm going to fish something with that deer head light fly that then I can work out of that structure and then let my line take it down and I can dive it over that structure. And I have caught tons of big fish just hanging out underneath those logs just on the other side. So it just really depends on the river. Also undercut banks and stuff. You want to be able to pop it underneath that undercut bank sometimes, and having something that's unweighted, it's not going to do that. Where a weighted fly, you can skip it in there sometimes.
Yeah.
And then I saw someone was asking about size. So a good general size to start with, if you're looking for just any fly, just a woolly bugger is a good size to start with. But I feel like that kind of 4-inch size, like those Peanut Envies, any of those Kelly Gallop patterns, and many more, Rich Trollis, any of those size, you can fish on any stream, even the small streams. I've caught some crazy big fish. You're always surprised of the size of fish that can be in those small streams, and they don't show themselves until a streamer comes bouncing into their life.
I think this is, looks like Mark, I don't know how to say your last name, Naninga. We understand sink tips. How about how to fish streamers, reading a stream, types of the year or times of the year? I think that's a really good next step probably to chat about.
Yeah, that's why we're talking about in the fall. It's a good time of year to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the transition times of the year, be it because of spawning or just other preparations, be it for the colder weather in the winter coming or in the spring when everything's warming up and fish are getting more active. Those are the times I feel like, at least around the Western US, people really hone in fall being number one on streamers. And people think like spawn brown trout. I think the thing that I've learned over time, it's actually a hashtag that has been associated with me. It's the saying I always say is there's no such thing as streamer season. We talk about seasons with fish. We talk about seasons with different flies and hatches. But the deal is bait fish live year round in the water. Like there is not a season for them. They're there. And typically, at least for a trout, they're opportunistic fish. So if they're swimming around, they're looking for food, and there's this high protein meal over here versus this size 26 midge, they're opportunistic. There's a good chance if things are right, they're going to go for that high protein meal. So I don't take streamers out of my fishing repertoire any time of the year anymore. I fish them constantly around. I have more productive days than others, of course, but there's never a time of year that I typically can't be successful in streamers. I just think there's times a year that have become very like textbook, like it's fall, I use streamers now, right?
Yeah. And I agree 100%. There's always a perfect time for streamer fishing. There are some times that are going to produce more bites, I think, low light times, and the same thing with dry flies. Low light times that, those fish are kind of on the prowl because of that. They can expose themselves a little bit more because they're not worried about other things. And you'll get people that fish, sometimes at night for that reason. They catch those big fish because, they're not worried about as much and they're on the prowl for the bigger food source. But really, I've caught some of the biggest brown trout I've ever caught in bright bluebird days.
Middle of the afternoon, hot temperatures.
Yeah. You might have to work a little bit more for it. But, that's why it's always a good time, And just like a brief story, we just got back from Montana, and my buddy and me were fishing, and we fished dries on the way down because of the way the stream was and the topography of it. And I was like, hey, let's hit, because there was a lot of down logs. And so we worked all this water, me at downstream with dries, and we caught fish. I was like, okay, we're going to fish streamers on the way back. And I'm just kind of showing him technique of what I would do. And first log, wham, 18-inch cutthroat. And I was like, okay, so you get it, right? And
that'll do.
yeah. So then every log we hit, we caught fish in the 18 to 20-inch range for the most part.
That's awesome.
Giant. And, and those fish, we had already walked through that water. They hadn't showed themselves with dries.
Yeah.
When we came back up with streamers, they definitely were on it.
They'll move for that bigger meal. Like they really will. Territorial or meal, they will move for it.
So let's see. Let's see if there's any other questions. I did get that. We get that question about distance between streamers. It's just going to depend, but I'd say anywhere from 24 inches to 26 inches is kind of a good range between those two flies.
Longer than the fish, for sure, that you're fishing for.
And there's times around here that I fish two flies, streamers specifically. If I'm targeting carp and bass, I can target both species with one setup, and I don't have to change, especially in the spring around here. It just depends on the scenario. But even then, I'm still probably in that 24 to 30-inch range between those flies.
Do you have a preference when you do set up those double rigs? Where do you have a belief in like dark following light fly or anything like that?
No. I more so do it in weight of flies. I try to keep the heavy fly on the outside, the tail end, just for casting purposes.
Mm-hmm.
But outside of that, that's really the only thing I mess with. And I don't do it a ton. Usually if I'm fishing streamers on a river for trout, I want that one fly because I can really tuck that into these areas where these trout hide.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a good thing to talk about too, is presenting the flies and what you would do in these scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about down and across earlier with swinging flies, which is super effective. If you're not having a whole lot of fun nymphing because you're breaking a fly off every so often, just tie a streamer off, start swinging it, take a few steps, swing it, and you'll cover water and you'll catch fish. But there's a ton of other options as presenting flies. The big thing I will say is strip set. Keep your rod tip down. That's a super important one, to always keep that rod tip down.
Rod tip down. Yeah. I think when I'm guiding or if I'm doing a streamer school, there's like a couple key things for presentation that I always try to dial people in on. I personally am a believer in the rod tip down, but it's rod tip down, and I usually try to get people to keep the first inch or so of the rod tip actually in the water. It just creates a very smooth and consistent resistance along that line. I'll have people actually pull their tip just out of the water, and I'll show them, hey, okay, do you see every time how when you strip, there's that little slack between the excess of your tip and where it actually enters the water? You'd be amazed at how that little bit of slack and the extra little bit of pull you have to give, you will lose fish in your strip set just from having that. So I usually always try to train people to keep a bit of their tip actually in the water for it. But the other thing too, and I see this a lot, especially with new streamer anglers, when they strip, they pull the line out to the side from the reel. And so I always try to get people, get your rod tip down, get your tip in the water, and pull straight back towards your hip bone so that you're in the straightest, most direct line to that fly and that fish. When you do this, again, you'll start to see it eats into your reel after a while. But you don't have a straight and direct connection through that line into the fly. And so you'll often lose fish. You'll feel the bump and you'll go to strip set like this, and the delay that's all created and just not the direct. People are like, I lose fish all the time. And I'll be like, all right, show me what you're doing. I'll get your tip down and strip straight back towards your hip. And all of a sudden they start connecting on those bumps and those takes. So I think, again, rod tip in the water to keep consistent tension around that line, and then stripping straight back to your hip. So you have a direct line and a direct pull to that fly. It's super
less friction. You're just going to be able to really get that hook in there. And it depends on the scenario, but most of the time we got to drive those hooks in pretty good to set that especially if you start fishing for other species like tarpon and stuff. I mean, we're
Mm-hmm.
really hammering those fish.
Yeah.
You'll get occasions where the fish grabs it right and turns, and that's
Mm-hmm.
really when you want to hit them. But, you can't do that all the time when you can't see the fish. But yeah, any slack in there, any bounce of that rod tip is going to really not help you in any way.
No.
So let me see. Retrieval rate's a good one too, because I think a lot of people try to burn them back too fast and they don't
Mm-hmm.
work the fly. So strip, pause, strip. Change that up. Make that fly dance in the water and make it
Mm-hmm.
look like something the fish wants to eat.
Yep.
They're not
Make it
if they
look
can't keep up
real.
with it, right? And if they can't keep up with it, they're not going to eat it if you're just ripping
Yeah.
it away from them the whole time.
Mm-hmm. I think that, and I'll tell people, bait fish don't swim to a metronome. So when you're stripping, they don't swim. They're not in the water like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Typically when you're imitating a bait fish, it's either because they're fleeing or they just got flushed by water, right? And so typically when you're representing that, you're not representing just a nice little Sunday drive for that bait fish. You're representing some kind of fleeing or flushing of them. And that's not going to be in any kind of rhythm. So to your point, a lot of times I'll tell people mix it up. Like I typically am a big strip as soon as it hits the water, like move it immediately. Our fish like that. So I usually have 1 or 2 big strips and an immediate pause, because that's usually also in our rivers where I'm at the ledge. And so I'll strip from the bank and then let it just kind of sink off that ledge for a second and then start picking it up again. And might do a few quick and another pause. But I really mix up my strips because, again, to your point, I think it doesn't look real otherwise, and the fish aren't going to eat it. You're still trying to present something fake as real to fool them, right? Just like you would be in your dragless drift and your nymph rig. So they don't swim to a metronome. So make them look real. Move, pause, go fast, go slow, give it a moment, but make it look real.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on moving the fly as soon as it hits the water, because I think that's a big place where people miss chances.
Mm-hmm.
If that fly is just sitting there not moving and it's moved 4 feet down the river before it moves, you've missed that opportunity at that one fish that could have been sitting there. And I've seen, I don't know how many times people make that mistake of not moving that fly. And I've seen a fish reject it, even though they haven't. Whereas if you put it down, it smacks, you do one little strip, and that fly's moving, you'll get that first bite usually right then.
Yeah. And sometimes, and I think on the other end of that, if you're not getting the bites right away, you're getting the fish's attention. Because on the other end of that is a lot of people want to strip from the bank and only do a few strips to pick up and cast again. And I'm like, no, keep stripping, because a lot of times, especially in clear water and stuff, your fish will follow that streamer for a second and like kind of check it out before they're like, okay, now I'm going to eat it. So, strip it, get it moving, and then keep it going to the boat or close to the boat or close to you if you're waiting as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think something else important before we move on is if you're moving the fly and the fish is following it and you continually move it the same way, it probably won't eat it. So change that up all of a sudden. Don't just stop it, because that'll turn the fish off too. But change your retrieval up a little bit, and you might, as soon as you get that fly dipping or diving, they might eat it instantly then.
Yeah, Adam just said I get a lot of fish only a few feet away from me. Yeah, I mean, that's super common. And a lot of people, it's a really balance. Get it moving when it hits the water, and work it just like you would work your drift when you're nymphing. Work your full line when you're stripping too.
Yeah, read that fish's body behavior when you can see the fish like that. And do something that's different. It might not eat the fly that first time, but the next fish, try something different, and you might get a eat. Something else we should probably touch on is throwing a mend. As soon as you place your fly in the water, throwing a mend upstream, it's going to get that fly down quicker. That can sometimes help, especially in fast current or if you're trying to get undercut banks.
Yep, agreed. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think too that depends on if you're wading or floating. I float a ton. I'm a ROS certified guide, so a lot of my guide trips and just my personal fishing, I love to be in my boat and from a raft. And so not only can that mend in certain instances be good for that exact point to get it down, but then there's some times where the flows of the water. I'm just moving too fast. And so I just got to get it in and strip it, right? Because I'm moving through a rapid or something. But when able, that quick upstream mend just to get it down without making sure it's an appropriate mend. So kind of like, again, when you're nymphing, you don't want to replace your whole flies upstream. So getting a good mend, but keeping the streamer where you want, not pulling the mend and pulling the streamer all the way back into the middle of the river at the same time.
Well, and if you mend right, you'll change the direction of that streamer upstream. Mm-hmm. If you change it the wrong direction going downstream, that fish is going to have to chase it downstream. So you'll give, if you mend upstream, you'll give your fly more time in that, hopefully, A zone. You know, that place where you can hang up in anything, you know, because there's so much stuff there, but there's always a fish in that spot. And so present as close to structure, mend, you know, get those flies in those places you're scared to get hung up, because there's more than likely a fish there.
Yep.
You break a fly off, you lose a fly, you got more in your box, I hope.
If I don't like get caught on the bank or make my rower pull over to the willows at least twice on the float, I am not getting close enough to the bank. I always tell people, I'm like, those are just really organic casts. That's what I call them. I'm like, I'm just being organic. It's very organic. They're like, oh yeah, that bait fish that came out of the willow into the river. It's very natural, Courtney. I'm like,
a hopper drop.
Right at the bank.
Yeah. That's kind of why the H3 is so nice, because it's so accurate at getting those flies in those zones.
Oh yeah.
And you know, it takes some practice, but if you never do it, you're never going to get that practice. So you lose some flies.
Happens.
Yep. Would you ever, kind of a good question is, would you ever add any weight to your leader, split shot, cone heads, anything like that, to get a different action?
So I feel like this is like a controversial question in streamer fishing. There's like team weight and team no weight, and I'm actually on team no weight. So a lot of people see it differently, but my personal belief is the minute I put a little bit of weight above my non-slip loop or whatever, I'm impacting the true motion of that streamer. And I just feel like, again, it's like, I think it comes back to like a confidence thing. I just feel like I can't get as natural of a look through that streamer. It creates like a jerk or a sink point. This is my personal feeling. And so I will use heavier streamers. Whether I buy them, I have them tied, or I tie them myself. A lot of times I will lead wrap shanks on them.
Right.
And I will try to include it in the actual fly instead of creating this single weight point that now here's your streamer and the loop, and now you have this weight point right here. And I think it does affect the natural swim of the streamer.
For sure. And that's the benefit of tying your own fly, is you can customize that to the way you want to swim. Less material with more weight, it's going to sink faster. More bushy or non-absorbent material with less weight, you're going to get that buoyancy. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, for sure. I haven't added. I usually will change my line. That's where because it just casts better. But I definitely know people that will do like the cone heads in front. Because the nice thing with the cone heads, it slides back to the fly, but then when you're fishing it, it'll slide forward. And just on casting as well, I guess we should touch on this, is open loop cast or Belgium cast is going to be the best option for that. So a low back angle cast to a high forward cast, which pops that fly up over your head, and you're not going to worry about it setting into your ear or whatever the case is, and not worried about the wind as much with that Belgium style cast.
Yeah.
Let's see. Have either of you caught peacock bass on streamers? If so, any stories, tips to share? I have. Down there, they're aggressive. So
they are aggressive. I don't know where in Florida you're going. I did it in Miami in the canals.
Yep. That's
it's so different from trout fishing, even just like the conservation side of it. It was like, oh no, just throw them on the bank, like hold them out of the water. They're fine. And I'm like, oh my God, they're going to die. They're like, no, these aren't trout. Yeah, they're aggressive, but they're fun. I actually like peacock bass. It's my number one, I think, species favorite to chase since that trip. My 40th birthday is in 2024, and I'm planning on booking myself like a real peacock bass trip next year as a birthday present. Like, they are so much fun, so aggressive, fun.
Yeah, they don't get as big as some of these other locations down in South America, but they can be super aggressive. And when you're there in Christmas, it's going to be a little bit more of a challenge, but they're still there and they're still hungry because I've been there in late November and caught them. Yeah, I'm going to Columbia in March next year. So we're going to go find some big ones. Yeah, let's go.
Please, can I come? That's what I'm looking at.
Probably
Columbia
space.
too. I started doing research in the last couple of weeks. Like, all right, I got to start figuring this out, figuring out seasons, places, times.
Yeah. Let's see. Before we get too out of the circle on the streamer fishing. So what type of water works best, would you say? Yeah, this is an easy one for me. I'll let you go ahead.
What was the question? Which one was it?
What type of water works best for streamer fishing?
Any water.
Yeah, you're right.
Any water. I mean, I think it's not about the water. For me, it's the presentation, right? So it's kind of what you were talking about earlier, where if I'm casting a streamer at the bank versus a log versus in a pocket below a boulder, I can fish it across any water. I may just change my presentation and my strip as a result of where I'm at, where I think the fish are sitting and how I'm trying to get that streamer in front of the fish in that area at the water column that I think they're at.
Right. And that's why it's so nice to have two rods rigged. You can have one with an intermediate or a floating line and one with a heavy sink and cover, especially if you're walk wading or drifting a river, you can really cover all those different scenarios.
Yeah.
Or if you're just fishing a 5-weight, having multiple densities of polyleaders, you can change those out pretty quick. Yeah, I agree. Same thing for me. I think water temp sometimes matters, maybe a little bit, depending on the scenario. If you get real cold water, especially around here for bass, obviously, but trout too, they get a little bit more lethargic. They're not as eager to grab. But if you get something close enough to their nose, they're still pretty eager to eat it.
But again, more than anything, I'm changing my presentation. Like because I'm probably just fishing deeper, right? So my presentation is aligned for more of a sink. It's moving a little slower because a bait fish would be moving slower in that cold water, right? With their metabolism slowing down. So I'm still fishing the water. I'm just changing my presentation personally.
Yeah, or fly, changing it to a jigging style fly where you can bounce it off the bottom and kind of keep it in location for longer.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all good. I mean, that's the nice thing with fly fishing or any fishing. There's no rules. You can change it up, and that's how you find what works for you and what is the best for that area that you're fishing. If you just get stagnant and never change, you tend to not catch as many fish. So I did see a question about stillwater retrieves. I'll let you kind of kick that off. That's I definitely see some differences depending on where you're fishing.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it depends on where you're fishing and what stillwater species you're fishing for. Like how I fish for a pike is different than how I fish for a trout, right? Some of it's not only like where in the lake I'm fishing. A pike, I'm going to be on bite wire with a much bigger streamer, and I'm going to have a much more erratic and intense and fast-paced retrieve typically. Versus a trout that I'm trying to retrieve. And like we kind of talked about earlier, at least for here in Colorado, our stillwaters love more man-made reservoirs, and we kind of have created drops in them. So I'm really focusing on getting past that drop, letting it sink, and then retrieving it back and up and over that drop, because that's where the fish are cruising. So I think that stillwater retrieve question can get really deep because where am I? What season is it? What am I fishing for? And, it can go, there's a lot of what ifs in that scenario, I feel like.
Correct. If you're just blind casting and you're just covering water, I think just a normal, not a crazy retrieve, just even like the finger roll retrieves where you're just actively moving the fly and keeping it kind of jigging in the water as you move it back to yourself is a good starting point. And then you go from there.
Yeah.
Let's see. I mean, is there anything else that you can think of on the streamer side that I've missed or what we have missed?
I don't think so. Somebody asked what streamer works best for bull trout. When I fished for bull trout, it was white streamers. It was white.
Yeah,
white. It was the reactivity, and it had to do with the, bait fish or other fish that they were aiming on, weight fish. be specific. They were looking to eat. And so I was white. That was what worked.
Yeah.
White streamer.
Mimic the natural food source that's in that river is the best thing you can say. But bull trout have definitely can be aggressive, and if you put it in the right place, if they're ready to eat, they're going to eat it. They like cutthroat a lot. I've caught many a cutthroat in the bull trout national.
They definitely do. That was one of the other key ones. I was up in Canada, and that was lots of cutthroat and lots of bull trout.
Yep. Any other questions we might miss? I did see one for floating lines. What length of leader? So I would just do a 9-foot leader.
Yeah.
You have, you go up in poundage, so you get that better turnover with a heavier streamer. But yeah, 9-foot leader gives you a little bit more sink possibly.
Yeah.
That's one thing I guess we never said is with a floating line or any of these lines that have a floating section, even if it's a 15-foot sink tip, eventually that line has to reach its max depth and then start moving up because you're stripping it back towards yourself. And that's why the depth charge line is kind of specific to what it is, because it's got that 30-foot sink, so you can keep that fly down longer. And then it's got an intermediate type 3 and then intermediate back section, which gives that line a direct contact with the fly at any of those depths. Ever streamer fish for perch? Every day I live in Texas. A perch, I'm assuming bluegill. Any other questions you see there? I think that's it.
Bill is coming out next week to Colorado, and he said he's fishing. I think he and his son are fishing with Zeke. Zeke is like our head guide and one of our regional managers. Bill, you're going to have a blast with him. He's hilarious. I don't know if you fished with him before, but you and your son will have an absolute blast. And Dot's arrow is about right. That's exactly one of Zeke's favorite sections to float. So you guys will have a blast.
Nice. Well, I guess that wraps it up for us. I want to thank everybody for coming out to all these lives. This is the last one of the Orvis Days presentations. And you can definitely go back and watch all these at a later date. They're recorded. So if you go to the YouTube links that they provide here, you'll be able to watch all those. And thanks, Courtney, for coming on and joining us last minute.
Yeah.
It was good.
Thanks,
Hopefully
Shawn,
everybody
for
learns some
coming
stuff.
to work.
Yeah, and call Trout call Trouts up in Denver or call us here in Plano or anywhere else that there's an Orvis dealer or shop, and we'll get you taken care of.
Absolutely. And best of luck streamer fishing.
Yeah, tight lines, and send us your pics. We need fish pics.
Tight lines and strip sets.
Yeah, right. Tip down.
Tip down.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Bill.